This morning, I want to talk about a fourth approach to public health, and this was what's called commonly the sanitary movement. This was pioneered in Britain in the 1830s and 40s, and it was then exported to the continent in North America, assuming particular forms in France and Italy with the actual rebuilding of cities in accord with sanitary principles. Now, the sanitary movement was the first to define itself as a public health movement, and it had two essential meanings for its term. The first was the prevention of infectious epidemic diseases, and the second was the removal of filth. So it's based, in a sense, on the relationship of filth and disease. Indeed, many people talk about the filth theory of disease as lying at the basis of the sanitary movement. Its focus, therefore, was on the towns and cities that had sprung up with urbanization and the Industrial Revolution. Epidemic diseases disproportionately claimed their victims in the cities, and correspondingly, the legacy of lasting effects was especially pronounced in urban areas, and the sanitary movement is one of those lasting legacies. Now, there is a theory that we may as well look at just for a second, developed by the British physician and demographer Thomas McCown, and it's often called his thesis, where he was dealing with the demographic fact of what he called a mortality revolution, a demographic transition in which cities, for the first time, become places that are dependent for their expansion not only on inward migration to the towns, but on the fact that the longevity and the birth rate come to exceed the death rate, which was something new, a real demographic revolution. And why was this achieved? And many people have thought and postulated that it was due to medical science, to conscious policy, and those sorts of explanations. McCowan instead stresses two factors. He sees this as largely unplanned and due to improved nutrition, but also, and that's the point this morning, to the role of sanitation. In other words, the population explosion, the demographic revolution, is something that he postulates was due to not to medical science, but rather to the sanitary movement and also to nutrition. Well, what was the background to the sanitary movement? We've seen and mentioned that there really was a tremendous challenge to health in this period of the Industrial Revolution in European history. There were tremendous changes afoot in British society. There was the rise of a modern commercial agriculture, and with it, enclosure, the driving of peasants off the land. We know about the major demographic growth that was underway by this period, supported by the new agriculture and the fading of the threat of famine and the fading of the threat of plague. There was the rise of manufacture and then the factory system, especially the textile industry, and the associated and unregulated horrors of things such as long hours, low wages, child labor. You know, too, that across Europe, urban populations doubled in the first half of the 19th century, and in so doing, overwhelmed the infrastructure of available jobs, the housing stock, sanitary arrangements, and all the rest, so that we see the rise of tenements, slums, sweatshops. There was a mass movement of population from countryside to town, and with that went psychological adjustments. There was a breakdown of older notions of social relations based on paternalism, of the customary notion of a moral economy based on moral obligation, and we see instead the rise of the principles of impersonal relations, of a free market economy and laissez-faire, epitomized in the new discipline of political economy, with such figures, of course, as Adam Smith, Ricardo, Jeremy Bentham, Thomas Malthus. The result, along with those transformations, was a rise of new social tensions. We've talked about the 19th century as the rebellious century. Now, in Britain, there were no social and political revolutions, nothing comparable to 1789 in France, or to what happened on the continent in 1830 and in 1848 and 9. But contemporaries weren't certain at all that this was going to be a lasting fortune for Britain. And indeed, Britain did have a number of signs of severe social tension as well. There were large-scale riots. One could mention the Chartist movement, and in the countryside, the movement known as Captain Swing. So urban and industrial centers also in Britain were perceived as dangerous politically for fear of the so-called dangerous classes who rioted, perhaps committed crime, threatened revolution, and were dangerous medically as well. That is, they were infected with cholera and other diseases. And it was cholera in particular that was a real prod to action, this new and most feared disease of the 19th century. It's not by chance, then, that the sanitary movement begins in the 1830s and 40s in Britain, after, that is to say, the first pandemic and the second of Asiatic cholera. And it lasts intermittently down through the First World War. And this really was a vast movement. It was nothing less than the retrofitting of the urban centers of the nation with the specific goal of removing filth, because filth was held to be the cause of disease. So we're talking about one of the great public works projects of modern history. The establishment of sewer systems, a whole infrastructure of water mains, of waste removal, street cleansing, improved and less crowded housing, the creation of parks and public spaces. So we can see that Victorian Britain truly was preoccupied with that combination of excrement and water. All of this, of course, presupposed as well the emergence of a modern state. It was state power that alone provided the wealth and organizational structures that were needed to carry out this enormous project. And in turn, we can see the causal chain working in both ways, because the sanitary movement was a very important factor in reinforcing state power. Its implementation meant that the state now invaded areas of life formerly regarded as private and appropriated for itself enormous new powers.